Okay, let's go ahead and get started because this is going to take, unfortunately, this was supposed to have been a debate, and Shabir Ali tried to get Jamal Badawi to debate me, and he just refused to do so. I have debated Jamal Badawi. In fact, my very first debate that I did was with him back in 1995. So this is 23 years later, and still he won't come back. And back then in 1995, I gave 10 historical challenges to the Quran. This was at Cambridge University in Britain. He did not respond to any one of those 10, not once. And now he's had 23 years to respond. He still has not responded to those 10 challenges. Those 10 challenges are still out there. And they're not to do necessarily with the Quran. They're to do with the whole emergence of Islam, how Islam actually began. So since he would not come to the debate, we asked if he would Zoom. We could at least Zoom him in. And so we could have a reference back and forth. He still refused, but what he did is he gave us these 15 clips. These are his 15 clips. Now, I only have an hour to go through them, and the clips by themselves take over an hour. They take an hour and 20 minutes, or an hour and 10 minutes, sorry. So there's no way I will have no time to respond. So what, George being George, he only gave me these clips on Tuesday. So I have quickly gone through all these clips for you and shown, and I've come up with responses to every one of them. So I'm not going to be able to show you all the clips. I'll review what he says in the clips. I'll show you maybe about 5 of them, just so you can see who Jamal Badawi is, Dr. Jamal Badawi. Now, who is he? Dr. Jamal Badawi was considered to be the authority in the English language on the Quran back in the 70s, 80s, up until the 90s. He is the one that trained Shabir Ali. So Shabir Ali was his student. And I've debated both of them. I've only debated him once, but I've debated Shabir Ali 6 times. And I find him, what do you think, David? Do you think he's the best they've got? Yeah. He's certainly the most pleasant, and he's the nicest to debate. And I would any day debate Shabir Ali, but he will not debate me after 2014 because of what happened in Toronto. What has happened is, what we're doing now is we're in this kind of context, we're going to just have to take what they're saying and then write rebuttals to it. Now, it's unfortunate that he's not here, or we don't have a Zoom connection so he could actually respond to what I'm going to say. But we'll send this to him, and he'll come back and see if he can respond to any of this. So let's show you how you can answer these kind of questions. Let's do that much. So let's go through the first one here.
The Quran has had a great impact on history. It changed the lives of countless millions of people who embraced Islam. And it did influence the whole world, even Islamic and non-Islamic world. The Quran was the moving and dynamic force behind those changes. And until today, as you may hear of the stories of some of those who came to Islam, like Yusuf Islam and others, that oftentimes it began even by reading an interpretive translation of the meaning of the Quran, like Yusuf Ali and others, which does not even fully capture the original Quran, yet it was sufficient in many cases to make a lot of people see the light.
So what he is saying there, basically, he's saying if you look at the Quran, one of the greatest reasons why we know it's been preserved, and this whole set of talks is on the preservation of the Quran, and one of the primary reasons is because how it's affected people's lives, how people have adhered to it, how people have been converted by it. And there is some truth to what he's saying here, and I would agree. When I did my master's thesis on this very question, why do people become Muslims? Why do they convert to Islam? Number 9 on the list of 12, number 9 was this very reason. They loved the Quran. They saw that there's a sonority in it. There was a cadence. They loved they loved the poetry when they read the Quran. And it's fascinating to me when you hear that, but nonetheless, there are people around the world that are converted and that come to it. And so he's saying, because of this, this is a proof of the preservation. Now, when you take and open the Quran, you're reading it in English. So when you read it, it looks very confusing, doesn't it? It's disjointed. There are no transitional phrases. So there's only one complete story, and that's in chapter 12. So content-wise, and if you've been hearing what David's been saying and what we've been saying this morning, it is full of contradictions, it's full of borrowings, it's full of all kinds of certainly historical anachronisms and lots of scientific errors. Look at all the scientific errors that David came up with this morning. on that level, should not be something that should attract people. So I would wonder why Jamal Badawi is using this, but then no one's really refuting him in public, and so possibly that's what he's doing. What we have found, and when I did my survey with people that came through, I found that a lot of times it was the friendly influence from others, friends who read the Quran to them. Sometimes it was from hearing the muezzin. They thought it was beautiful when you're in a foreign country, or if you've been brought up in that foreign country and you hear it every morning, was another reason. And some people were even influenced by debate that they had heard on the Quran, usually by men like Jamal Badawi, or it is a very romanticized ideal. What we tend to find is with people that come through this way, they usually give up on it within about 3 years. It only takes 3 years for it to wear off. So don't get too worried about that statement. Now let's go to his next one, which is the internal evidence.
Number one, is there any evidence in the Quran itself, from within the Quran, that it will be preserved? First of all, we note that we do have explicit and clear statements in the Quran that it will be preserved. And the surah and ayah number that you see on the screen, 15:9, is only one example, but it's one of the oft repeated and quoted ayahs from the Quran, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. You must have heard that many times. It is we means Allah. We here is the plural of majesty, not a committee of gods. It's we who revealed the reminder. Reminder is a reference to the Quran. And it is we, Allah, that we're going to take care of preserving it. Like I said, this is only one. You find other ayat in the Quran. وَإِنَّهُ لَكِتَابٌ عَزِيزٌ لَا يَأْتِيهِ الْبَاطِلُ مِنْ بَيْنِ يَدَيْهِ وَلَا مِنْ خَلْفِهِ تَنزِيلٌ مِنْ حَكِيمٍ حَمِيدٍ. That's in Surah 41. We find evidence also when the Prophet ﷺ used to speed up with recitation after Jibreel, when he dictates the Quran to him. He was afraid that he might miss a word. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala assured the Prophet, as we see in Surah Taha, in Surah 20, in Ayah 114, وَلَا تَعْجَلْ بِالْقُرْآنِ مِنْ قَبْلِ أَنْ يُقْضَى إِلَيْكَ وَحْيُهُ وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا. Don't hasten with the Quran before its revelation is completed to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and say, O Allah, increase me in knowledge. But there is something also pertaining directly to preservation that we find in Surah 75 in Ayah 16. That's even much more revealing. It says to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه. Don't move your tongue in haste concerning it, that means the Quran. It is up to us, means to Allah, جمعه وقرآنه, to preserve it and to promulgate it. So as far as the evidence in the Quran, these are only examples of many.
Okay, he went through quite a few references there. He started out with the majestic we, and this is a conundrum for many Muslims. It shouldn't be really that much of a conundrum, because this is just a simple borrowing from the biblical text. We also have the majestic we. Although many scholars are now debating whether or not the majestic we is more a plural form, since Elohim is three or more. Nonetheless, I would suggest that those who wrote the Quran, and you notice I'm saying those, I do believe it is plural number of people, that they probably borrowed it from the biblical text. That's neither here or there. He then goes into Surah 24, verse 49, and Surah 98, verse 2 to 3, and Surah 80, ayah 15 to 16, which says nothing about preservation at all. They only talk about a pure Quran. Now, if you want to stretch that definition, I don't think he has a right to stretch it. They're just talking about the fact that the Quran is pure, that it is full, that it is complete. Surah 20, ayah 114, and Surah 75, ayah 16 also do not speak about a preservation. They speak about not reading it hastily. That's all they're saying. Don't read it hastily. Now, I don't know where he's getting preservation out of that. Surah 5, ayah 47 is a curious choice. I'm wondering why he chose that one, because if you were to read from 46 all the way up to 48 of Surah 5, It speaks about the authority of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and not necessarily about the preservation of the Quran. In fact, there's nothing about the preservation of the Quran there. It's the preservation of the Bible, which is an own goal. He should have even brought that one up. Therefore, the only one amongst that whole litany of verses that he brought out is Surah 15, Ayah 9. We will guard it. Is the only verse on preservation, which is rather odd. If Allah can guide the Quran, then where did he? We'll guard it. If he guarded the Quran, where is this Quran that he has guarded? From what we heard this morning, we can't even find one Quran from the 7th century at all. We can't find one complete Quran from the 8th century. Did I say just 8th century? We can't find a complete Quran until the 20th century, 1924. 94 years ago. The only Quran that's complete is the Quran we have in our hand today, and that is only 94 years ago, and that was only created because of a problem within the high schools there in Cairo in Egypt, where they needed to have uniformity, and that's why it was created to bring uniformity to the high schools in Cairo, made then Egypt-wide in 1936, and then adopted by the Saudi Arabian government in 1985. Really, basically, it's only 33 years old. So this idea that Allah can guard it, he's doing a pretty lousy job if it takes him 1,300 years to finally guard what then we have in our hand today. Badawi should have used Surah 10, Ayah 64 and Surah 4, Ayah 82, and really brought in the Surah like it argument, because those are much, much stronger arguments for preservation than 15, verse 9. Notice that all of these examples are rejected by Surah 2, Ayah 106, and Surah 16, Ayah 101, the idea of contradiction. So even that destroys his whole argument for preservation there from an internal standpoint. Finally, we need to ask, why is it, if he's going to talk about this Quran, which Quran is he talking about? It cannot be the Topkapi. That has over 2,000 variants. It cannot be the Ma'il. That one only has 43 chapters, and it is from the mid to late 8th century. He cannot use the Samarkand. That one only goes up to 43. Only one chapter is complete. In that 43 chapters, he cannot use the Petropolitanus. That only has 26% of the Quran. He certainly cannot use the Husayni manuscript, because that is from probably the 9th century, and it is not complete. And then he certainly cannot use the Sana manuscript, because as we now know, that begins to actually be written in the late 7th century, then has another layer on top of it, which was introduced in 705, which does not agree with the lower layer. In 63 verses, it has 70 differences. Even with the Quran that we're having today, both layers disagree with the Quran they have today. So which manuscript has God guarded and preserved? I'd love to have an answer on this. I'd love to know what he would say to that. Let's move on to the next one, which is number 3.
But in what sense was the promise made in the Quran for its preservation? Here we find evidence internally of the dual promise of preserving the Quran. First of all, memory, which is even more important, much more important. It is interesting to notice, for example, that in one hadith in Sahih Muslim, it is said that the Prophet ﷺ was told that you will be given a Quran, لا يمحوه الماء, which will not be erased with water, because that's the way sometimes when they write in something and then they want to clean it, they wash it with water to write again. And some people did not pay enough attention to this, that forget even about any written record of the Quran. The promise is that this Quran can never disappear. You can burn all copies of the Quran in the world. You can erase any manuscript, but the Quran would remain. For example, the first citation in Surah An-Nur, Surah 24, we are told quite clearly that the Quran would be preserved mainly in the hearts of people. بل هو آيات بينات في صدور الذين أوتوا العلم وليس في كتب. بل هو آيات بينات في صدور الذين أوتوا العلم. The Quran is nothing but clear signs in the hearts. Didn't say books, even though writing will come. But that particular one focus in the hearts, sudur, those who are given knowledge. I put that first because I think it's even the more important one.
Okay, we're going to have to hurry it up here because this will take all time. Notice what he's starting to get to, and here's where his agenda starts to show. What have you noticed here? He's already dismissing the written text, and he's now going back to memorization. This is the new tactic that's now coming all over the world. We're getting Muslims all the time say, we don't need the manuscripts. Why do you think they're saying that? Because they've heard that we now have seen the manuscripts for the same time. When I started this back 37 years ago, we never heard this kind of argument. I never heard memorization does it, folks. It was always, we have hundreds of thousands of Qurans, all of them from the 7th century. None of them are different. They are all exactly the same. They are all complete, and they have never been changed. Not one word has been changed. By the time I got to London in 1992, it was down not to hundreds of thousands, it was down to about 1,000. By that time, it was down to 1,000. By then, 1992, Muslims say, we have 1,000 manuscripts of which we now we have absolute proof that they are exactly the same. They have never changed. They are all complete. Exactly what Muhammad was given, exactly what Uthman had canonized. Then in 2014, we got down to 6 manuscripts. These 6 manuscripts were the ones that I argued for in 2014. From 2014, we destroyed those 6 manuscripts. Then as of last year, it was reduced just to 1 of those 6 because the Sana manuscript was shown. They thought the Sana was going to be their crowning achievement until Asma Hilali came out with her book last year. Asma Hilali pretty much destroyed that unknowingly. She didn't plan to do that. She tried to argue within the traditions, but most every scholar is laughing her out of court when she says that these changes that are there in the lower text are because of students. Like you would waste your time with little students. Children, she even puts, these are children writing homework. No, you would not waste your time writing homework. And the irony is, can you show me from where, if this is the earliest Quran you can get from some students, where is the original from which they were copying? Okay? That's what we're asking for, one original. So but what has happened now is they're no longer holding on to the Sana manuscript. They are now coming back to the Topkapi. And that has come since last year. Now what you're going to hear is Topkapi only. That's the beauty of it. Wait till November, because in November we're going to destroy the Topkapi. I can't do it today. Now let's go ahead, and I'm not going to do the next one because we're going to run out of time. So what he says in the next segment, he says, it is written down at the beginning in Surah 96, verse 1 to 4, and the word ikra, which means write, supported by the pen, says it was written down. So now he's going back. He's just contradicted himself, what he just said in this previous video, saying we don't need the writing, it's the memory that's the most important. Now he's saying, well, actually, we do need the writing. You know, it's fascinating because I don't know of any Muslims that would translate ikra to mean write down. It means to recite. It means to recite. It has always been to recite. So that whole story must be thrown out if he's going to hold to that. And then we need to ask, if it was written down, what did they write down? Where is it? Would you like to show us where this reference is? In the next segment, he then goes into prior biblical corruption. What he says is, does Allah preserve the Quran, but why is it that he preserves the Quran, but he doesn't preserve the earlier references? That's a good question. Why is it Allah preserved the Quran, but he didn't preserve the Old Testament and the New Testament? And his answer to that is because it came to the Jews and Christians, and the Jews and Christians were not strong enough to preserve it. So therefore, they are the ones to be blamed. Don't blame Allah, blame the Jews and the Christians. So that finally, God then brought his final revelation to Muhammad so that it would preserve the corruption of the earlier revelation. And then he says, one thing we can know, though, is that which is preserved from the Old and New Testament is where all 3 scriptures agree. And his only example that he gives where all scriptures agree is that both the Old and the New and the Quran agree on the oneness of God. Ooh, I love that. The oneness of God. And then he goes to Surah 5:47, showing that the earlier ones chosen to preserve Allah's word, they failed because of the Jews, but not because of Allah, and that Allah himself would now preserve it, that Allah now is going to preserve this one. So what was he? Kept napping? Was he napping while the Old and New Testament were around, and suddenly he woke up because the Quran was here? So you can see there's some real problems with his own presuppositional base. Either Allah can preserve it for all time, or he can only preserve it since the 7th century. Which seems to pretty much be a very ineffectual Allah. Nonetheless, the responses you give to this, there's quite a few. There is an internal contradiction here. Either God can preserve his word or he can't. And it looks like he can't. Certainly not before the 7th century. Now, ironically, he introduces verse 47 of chapter 5, which says the Christians are to judge by their scriptures, and verse 48, which says the Quran confirms them both, suggesting pretty clearly that both of the earlier scriptures are not corrupted. And I don't know why he likes to come back to chapter 5, verse 47 and 48, because it does not help his argument whatsoever. Does Badawi really believe that the oneness found in the Old and the New Testaments is the same as that found in the Quran? God's oneness is clearly working in three persons in both testaments, but it's great that he finally admits that Allah is truly triune in all three revelations. So if he's going to talk about the oneness, we need to define what that oneness is. Don't let them define that oneness. And of course, the oneness that we see in both the first two revelations are one yet three. When in Surah 5, 46 and 48, do we find the earlier revelations failed? I don't see that in those references. So why is he referring to that? Where in these verses do we find that Allah is now preserving all three revelations? So he needs to come up with better support than that. Note, Dr. Badawi cleverly admits only those parts of the Bible which agree with the Quran are the uncorrupted scripture. If Allah now has the responsibility of preservation, earlier given to the humans, where was he before, and why since the 7th century has he not been able to preserve one single copy which is complete or unchanged? Okay? In the next one that we go on to, it's 8 minutes, so we're not going to have time to go through that. He talks about the stages of preservation, and he talks about Abu Bakr. Remember, Abu Bakr was given the authority, or he took the authority to create that first recension between 632 and 634. And then he says that it was memorized during the time of Muhammad, so therefore it was not written down, it was memorized, and that memorization was perfectly legitimate, getting back to memory again. And then he comes up with this word called mutawatir. Now, if you anything know about the tawatar or tawatir references, that is a chain of narrations that all Muslims go to find what is authentic or not, or what is unauthentic. And he says, interestingly, this chain of narrations proves that the Quran has been correctly preserved. No Jews or Christians can do this. Clearly attacking us. He says, and he goes on, he spends a good bit of time saying, I've never seen a Christian at all who can memorize the New Testament. Now I understand, Steve, are you here? There is, a friend that actually has memorized the entire New Testament. Do you not, Steve? You've memorized the entire Gospel of John. In fact, there are quite a few Christians we know that have memorized. Say again? You're getting close. But the friend you know that actually trained you up memorized the entire New Testament. So there are people, but that's not the point. That's not the point. We'll get into that as to how you can answer that. The hadith say that Muhammad reviewed it annually, and then he had 52 wrote it down, and then memorization, he said, is enough. We don't need it written down. So he keeps on contradicting himself as he's talking about it. But Abu Bakr had it compiled. It was already written, and after that, 70 memorized it who were killed at the Battle of Yamama. But all they needed were 2 witnesses. And that then was given by Umar to Hafsa, his wife, who then hid it under her bed for 18 years. Now, how do we respond to this? Well, I think the best thing to do, if you want to respond to it, just open up the hadith. Open up to volume 6, hadith number 509 and hadith number 510. Just keep a copy of that in your Bible or in your Quran. Maybe not in your Bible, in your Quran. Keep a copy of both the Arabic and the English. We're going to give it to you. It's going to be on our papers that we give you tomorrow. Print it out and just let them read it. When you read it, it destroys everything that pretty much destroys every notion they're making. When you look at Al-Bukhari, volume 6, 509, first of all, remember Al-Bukhari was writing this in 870. So this is the late 9th century that he's writing it, redacting it back 240 years. So why would we have to wait till Al-Bukhari to get this even written down is the first question you need to ask it. It is clear here that it was not fully memorized, but was also written on palm stalks and stones. So it's very clear in black and white, this was not memorized. Otherwise, why did Zayd bin Thabit even need to have to write it down? So throw that out the water. Jews and Christians don't need to memorize because we have a trustworthy text. That's why we don't memorize it. We don't need to because the text is in our hand. And that's why we translate it into every language, 2,500 languages, because we trust the text more than someone's memory. Why? Well, play Chinese Whisper sometime and see what happens after 15 minutes. If I say something to him, if I say he sends it on to him, by the time it gets over to you, what I tell him and what you tell me are 2 different things. That's a great game to play in birthday parties. Note that Badawi's constant reference to memorization suggests he knows his text is corrupted. You can see he's now pulling away from the text itself. Then he contradicts himself and admits 52 companions wrote it down, proving that there was a text to be found. Where are they? Where are these 52 references or these 52 texts that he's referring to? And the reason? Well, because 70 memorizers died at Yama, so memorization wasn't good enough. So he just contradicts himself within the same clip. He says, all we need is memorization, but we had to write it down because many of those who had memorized it were dying. So which are you going to come back to? You can see there is some cognitive dissonance going on even as he's speaking. Moreover, why did Zayd need to go to stocks and stones if memorization was sufficient? Then in the next clip, it's over 7 minutes long, he goes into the second stage, which is the second codis, which is the second recension, which is found in chapter 6, hadith number 510. So the first one with Abu Bakr is chapter 6, hadith number 509. The second one is chapter 6, hadith, or volume 6, hadith number 510. And he brings in this whole thing with ahruf. Are you all familiar with ahruf? Do you know what I mean by ahruf? The readings, the 7 readings. This is what Muslims talk about all the time. The 7 readings. He introduces it. And he makes a big distinction between the ahruf and qira'at. Now, who are our Arab speakers here? Are any Arab speakers? Sir, can you tell me the difference between ahruf and qira'at? It's 7 readings. Okay, now wait, what's the difference between them? Exactly. I have never seen a Muslim, and you can't even explain it, can you? No. This is the problem. What's the difference between ahruf, or the 7 readings, and the qira'at, which there are 37 of them that we have on our hands today? The qira'at are the diacritical differences. The ahruf are the dialectical differences. Are you familiar with dialectical differences? Do you know what dialectical differences are in Arabic? Okay, which country are you from? Okay, now in Egypt, whenever you go down to your local shop there in Cairo and you buy a newspaper, when you buy that newspaper, are there any vowelizations or diacritical, or there are diacritical, but are there any vowels in your edition of the newspaper? Why not? Did you hear that? What you're saying is, if you're going to print a newspaper in Egypt, you want them to be able to read it in Jordan, you want them to be able to read it in Morocco, you want them to be able to read it in every Arab nation, right? And every Arab nation has a different dialect, am I correct? And the way you delineate a dialectical difference in an Arabic text is through the dhamma, the kasra, and the fatha, am I correct? Absolutely. That's why they keep the dhamma, the kasra, and fatha off on every newspaper today, so that it can be sold more. You get more newspapers sold that way. Dialectical differences require vowelization. There was no vowels in the 7th century. Vowels were only created in the 9th century, 200 years later. So how can Badawi be talking about the ahruf here? There is no ahruf, there is no dialectical difference. He goes on and spends minute after minute talking about how these Armenians, these Azerbaijanis, they had a different dialect, and that's why we had to have 7 different dialectical differences, and that's why Muhammad, hearing you say it and hearing you say it, 2 different people, they were saying, how can it be both? He says, both are correct. Yes, they are correct when you say it, but not when you write it. Muslims don't know Arabic. And that's why they're making this and this is a man who has Arabic as his native tongue. He has no idea that there was no vowelization to make a delineation within the text in the 7th century. This could have only been an argument for the 9th century. And why do you think you have Bukhari even writing this down? Because he's writing at the late 9th century, when there would have been dialectical differences. Are you following me? Is anybody following me? Okay? This is why I love it. They're shooting themselves in the foot, and Badawi, the best they've got, is making this mistake. He should know better. That's why it's so good to have some Arab speakers here to help us with that. So he goes on and says about these Armenians and these Azerbaijanis that's the reason why there was that Uthman had to then write a second recension. And that's the reason then he had to burn them. Wait a minute. Why do you burn a text if it's dialectically different? There is no dialectical differences without vowelization. and especially without any diacritical marks. There had been no diacritical marks. They were not invented until the 8th century. That's another 150 years later. That's why it makes my job so easy. When you get the brightest in the world making these kind of mistakes, with this is the best they've got, and they make this kind of rudimental mistakes, you can see why we need to be careful. Don't let any Muslim get away with this. These dialectical differences did not exist in the text. And when you look at the manuscripts that we're going to produce in November, you will see there are no dialectical differences. These are all consonantal texts. Let's move on to the next one.
And still, in spite of all that you say, some people still in the Western frame of mind say, how could anyone memorize that whole book? Even at the time of the Prophet. And what they forget, that the Quran was revealed in piecemeal over a period of nearly 23 years, a little here and little there. And that makes it a lot easier to memorize than saying, all right, take that whole book, memorize it, and come to tell me in 2 hours. It was all period. A whole period for. Fourthly, unlike the Hebraic law or the Torah, or the teaching of the New Testament, which was used, yes, but not really anything that comes closer to the constant use of the Quran in the daily life of the Muslim. The Muslim pray 5 times a day. And there is always not only the Fatiha, the opening surah of the Quran, there is encouragement of reading beyond that. And of course, they were not like us today, rushing, Al-Fatiha, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu Akbar, Qul a'udhu birabbil falaq, Allahu Akbar. These people used to pray in much longer and elaborate way than most of us are doing today. You find some ahadith, even that in the same rak'ah, you finish Surah Al-Baqarah and go even beyond. How many of us even can take that? Anyway, so the Quran was recited every day in prayer, in required prayer. It was recited in nafil prayer, in sunnah, encouraged or non-mandatory prayers. And then we find lots of evidence in sound ahadith in the variety of hadith book that it was the custom of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ to recite the Quran at night. Some spend most of the night reciting the Quran. Look at the significance and implication of this hadith. When the Prophet ﷺ forbade that you should finish the Quran in less than 3 days. Suppose even that statement came earlier when the Quran was not completed. Still, it indicates that some people were doing it. That he said, take it easy, not less than 3 days. But again, it encouraged to be, not much more than 7 days. And now, when people finish the Quran in 1 month or 2, they think that they are really doing a good job. So the constant use of it. But the use of the Quran also was not only for prayer or worship or recitation at night or teaching. More importantly, it was for learning how to apply it to their lives. So whenever there was a dispute or problem, and you find that still in books of jurisprudence until today, he says, no, you should not do that, or you should do that, and the evidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and then he quotes the ayah from the Quran. It was a reference book for all phases and aspects of the life of the community. But finally, that is something that shocks a lot of people when they know about it. When you tell them, very simple statement, tell them today, in the 20th century, in spite of the loss of the eloquence that reached its epic at the time of the Prophet and Sahaba, in spite of the weakness of the memory, we depend on anything now. Some of you who have kids in the school, these calculators? If you ask them if he doesn't have calculator, add up 22 and 29, it might take them half an hour. He says, give me a calculator. So the memory today has been spoiled with the availability of all this stuff that we have. It might get even weaker. In spite of that big lag, you can find today, not adults, children as young as 9 or 10 years old, whose mother tongue is not Arabic, who memorize the entire Quran from A to Z with the exact punctuation. And some people are not aware, non-Muslims in particular, that every year there are various competitions of memorizing the Quran, and some are children. And their language, their mother tongue is not Arabic. They could be Indians, Nigerians, Malaysians, Indonesians, you name it. Let alone those who find it easier even because it's their language and they can understand. No wonder Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated in the Quran, and it was repeated in the same surah so many times, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. Indeed, we made the Quran easy for remembrance. Is there anyone who heeds it? Today in North America even, let alone the Muslim world, where you get tens of thousands of hafiz, and those brothers and sisters who come from the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent, of course the term hafiz is very common, someone who memorizes the entire Quran, even though my only reservation that when they lead Taraweeh, they read so fast as if a missile is going through without thinking about the meaning. But it shows that they really memorize very accurately and very correctly the entire Quran.
Okay, you should be able to know how would you answer that question? Anybody? How do you answer that response? Absolutely. Do you notice there's this romanticized view of this period called the period from 624 up to 661. This is a romanticized view of the rightly guided caliph. Caliphs, plural. And it's fascinating to me. You will see this over and over again, that was the apex of Arabic literature. That was the apex of the Arabic language. It was such an apex of the Arabic language that they couldn't even read it. It was unreadable. It was as crude as you can get. The Arabic comes from the Nabatean script. The Nabateans had an apex, and they had an enormous amount of poetry, but what they had in the 7th century was nothing to be crowing about. But yet you have this view in the 21st century that everything was beautiful back then. And that's why it's fascinating that you get this, but there's no way that you can support it or deny it. He wasn't there. What's more fascinating is, what is it that these millions or these tens of thousands of young children have memorized, these Hafiz today? How do we know that they're correct? What do you do to find out if they're correct? You look at the Quran, right? You always hold the Quran in front of you. To even know if there's any correction, you need to have a written text. That's why what he is saying only makes sense for the 20th, and he mentions that in the 21st century. It makes no sense for the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. And this is nothing more than redacting back a romanticized view. And the fact that millions of young kids are memorizing in a language they don't even understand, I would suggest you need to ask the parents of those young kids what they're doing to those kids. And these are probably thousands of overbearing beauty contest moms. And that's one of the real problems that they're finding in the Muslim world. The only thing they have to show their salvation is to memorize the Quran. Thank goodness we don't waste our time doing that with the Bible. Excuse me, Steve, you do, but you actually story it. That's why I just stepped all over him on that point. God forgive me for doing that. God bless you for the fact you do memorize it, but you use it. And if you ever want to see a guy really act out the Bible, ask him to get in front of his black screen there and do it. He did a little show for me this morning. Amazing. Now let's go into the next segment where he talks again. He brings up the 7 modes of expression. So now he's going back to the written text again. Now he continues with this memorization. You can see there's an agenda here. He's having a problem. He does not want to go back to the written text. He wants to stick with this memorization. So he goes back and he says, what are we going to do about these 7 modes of expression? This doesn't mean that it's a contradiction of meaning. In other words, and he gives the example of asarat and asirat, meaning that they are both the way, and kudibu and khudibu, which means that they are the same. It was for better understanding. Getting back to what he had said earlier. The problems with that is, much like I said earlier, there are no examples of ahruf, and his examples are qira'at different. Actually, he doesn't even give an example of ahruf. He's giving qira'at differences, which are well known, and they've been around for 1,000 years. They've been there. We know those differences. They've been around since the 9th century. So he's not telling us anything new. What's more than that, as Hatun has found, and when she looked at it, when you look at these differences, she came up with 60,000 of these differences. He just used 2 as an example. He's used 2, they're probably the easiest to use because they do not have much difference. What about using the ones that we had on the screen earlier this morning? And if these are if these are not a problem, then why are Muslims wanting to grab these from us when we introduced this at Speaker's Corner last year and almost didn't leave the corner? So you can see that there is a real problem with this, even the Qira'at delineations. Number 12, Uthman's, he talks about Uthman objection in dialects. And the question comes up, didn't the Uthmanic burnings constitute destruction of the Quran? Which is a good question. His answer is no, because there were others who didn't know Arabic, so they needed the Qurayshi uniformity. And then he brings up Tawatur again. The multiplicity of sources which determined Sahih, Hasan, and Daif helped. Uthman's decision was made in public, and no one else objected, but other companions who objected finally came around. Which is fascinating. Stop and unpack that. Arabic dialectical differences required diacritical marks and vowelization which did not exist in the 7th century, so burning manuscripts would have meant there were consonantal differences. Those burnings were not diacritical burnings, they were not vowelization burnings, because this is much too early. We're talking about 652. These are consonantal differences. That's why they had to burn them, because they absolutely changed the meaning of the text. This view of Tawatur delineations were only created in the 9th century, so again, much too late to be relevant to this whole argument. Why does he even bring it in here? And the fact that this decision, if true, was controlled by a caliph, in this case Uthman, proves that it was carried out from the top. It was carried out from the top, not by those who were around. And the fact that Badawi admits even Muhammad's companions, the Sahaba, finally came around proves it. He pretty much just contradicted himself in one sentence. They would have been there to correct him, yet they finally came around. Proves that they could not correct him, that this was done from on top. It was done by the caliph himself. In the 13th video, he goes on and he talks about the codices and the objections, the different metropolitan codices. And he talks about Ibn Masud's codex did not include the Fatiha, which is what we went about on this morning. But he says that's not a problem because the many trump the few. I think he's been watching too many Star Trek Enterprise videos. So all today know that the Fatah is in the Quran because the many trump the few. And there must be a reason he didn't put it in. He, meaning Masud, did not put it in. Then he quotes Muir, Dr. William Muir from the 1800s. And he says, Dr. William Muir concluded it was exactly the same Quran that we have today. And that Ali was caliph for 6 years. If he had 6 years, he would have objected if there were any differences. So how do you respond to that? Well, Badawi admitting that there were differing codices, the 4 metropolitan codices, as well as the possibly other 11 that were referred to by Arthur Jeffrey, and the 15,000 differences between these 11, proves that there was no initial agreement on the makeup of the Quran. That is very clear, and all of this is from the traditions itself. When he says, many trumps the few, what is he referring to? We only have 6 early codices to look at, and none are the same. None of them are complete, and none of them are the same as today's Hafs Quran. So where is this many he's referring to? 6? Not very many. Today's Hafs was only created in 1924, made Egypt-wide in 1936, and made worldwide in 1985. So many here are older than the Quran. That means many of you sitting here are older than the Quran. So where is he talking? Again, he's only talking about modern-day Qurans. But he's redacting what his own experience is, and he's redacting his own experience back onto the 7th century. You cannot do that, and he's not going to get away with that if he tries to bring that into the 21st century. All aberrant Qurans, including the Shia Quran, would have been long since destroyed. That's why he can't find any Shia Qurans. Of course they're not around today. Listen, they burned, according even to their own traditions, they burned everything in Uthman's time, and then according to their own scholars, they drowned what was left over there in Egypt in 1924. So either through burning or drowning, they get rid of any Qurans that don't agree. So and then his idea that Badawi contradicts himself when he says either the Sahaba finally came around or they were strong enough to control Uthman. Which is it? Were they able to control Uthman, or did they finally give in? It looks like both were going on, and certainly they were not able to control it. It looks like this was authority from the top. And to quote William Muir, who was writing in the 1800s, is Badawi aware of the fact that he's quoting a 19th century author who was actually a friend of Dr. Carl Fander, and who was confronted by Dr. Carl Fander for saying this very thing because he didn't understand. He was nothing more than a government servant living in India, had no scholarship like Fander had, did not study the early traditions like Fander did, was not even aware of any modern manuscripts like Fander was, and when they didn't even know what manuscripts he was talking about when he made this statement. So not only is it over almost 150-year-old statement, there was no Qurans that Muir was referring to. Be careful of your sources. And then, of course, last and most, we don't even know what Ali wrote. So how can Badawi be so sure that Ali would have objected? What would he have objected to until we have a Quran to look at? All of them which have been destroyed. Now let's do the last two, and we'll bring these ones as our final ones. So here's number 14.
Cities. Finally, one point only for the sake of connecting between this and another very curious and important topic. Very interesting one. An indirect one that sometimes when you tend to think about the authenticity of the Quran, you keep focusing in depth on preservation and by memory, by writing, codices, and so on. But there is something very simple and very logical. Many of you are familiar with the literature that came up in recent times about the Quran, the A'jaz, the miracle of the Quran, not from the standpoint of historical or archaeological argument, but from purely scientific, decisive, known science, not scientific theories, established facts of science. And you're lucky here in Toronto that you have, of course, Dr. Keith Moore, and some of you must have seen his lectures about the amazing, precise expression in the Quran about human embryology, even genetics, a science that developed only in recent decades, that shows that indeed the Quran could have not been written by human. My question here is this: aside from the argument on the issue that we didn't deal with today, the authority of the Quran, the evidence that it is impossible that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ wrote that, or any human, because these are scientific inventions that we only learned recently. Aside from that line of argument, my question is very simple. If indeed there was the slightest tampering in the words of the Quran, how come these amazing discoveries are known today? In other words, if somebody tampered with the Quran, and in the ayat in Surah Al-Mu'minun, Surah 23, that deals with the embryonic stages, or ayat that gives a clear indication about genetics, that it is the sperm of the man that determine the sex of the fetus, not the egg, which is established in genetics now. If there was the slightest tampering, would we have that precise expression in the Quran today? So that could be another issue that you can go on and research and relate it actually to the issue of authenticity.
Well, I think, yeah, from David's talk earlier today, you can pretty well destroy that argument. The idea of scientific proof as proving the preservation of the Quran. Science should not be used, since almost every Quranic scientific proof is borrowed from other sources. We can show every one of them have been found in previous sources. What's more, when he quotes Dr. Keith Moore, we actually got on the phone to Dr. Keith Moore to find out why he had said this. And in the background, we could hear his wife say, "Don't answer them, don't answer them. Put the phone down, put the phone down." She was telling her husband. And he was struggling. He didn't know what to do. Because what had happened was that he was given this book and he read it and about the embryological cycle. And then he immediately said, well, this is actually pretty good. This is actually very good material. They immediately asked him if he would go on a speaking tour, and they paid for his tour, put him up in huge, beautiful hotels, and gave him an enormous stipend for doing that, and then was able to quote him that, see, one of the most eminent embryologists, Canadian embryologists from today, is supporting the fact that the Quran is scientifically valid, and this could not have been known prior to 1935 when the microscope was invented. How could someone have known about the zygote? How could someone have known that it is the sperm that actually that gives the sex of the child? How could somebody have known about the alaka stage, the chewed mass stage? And how could somebody have known about the bones preceding the flesh? How could somebody have known this? And of course, unless this is a proof that Muhammad was given scientific proof. Dr. Keith Moore was not aware of the fact that these 4 embryological stages are found in previous writings by a man named Galen, writing in the 2nd century AD. He was a Jewish embryologist who talked about the exact same 4 stages that are found in the Quran. His writings became very popular in the city of Ctesiphon, which later became Baghdad, so that when the Quran was finally written in what is then became Baghdad, you can see then why they were familiar with this embryological cycle and why you find it right through the Quran. But here's the problem. If you're going to borrow from another source, be careful that that other source is correct. Do you see a problem with those 4 stages? No embryologist today would agree that that is correct. Why? Look at the last 2 stages. The bones do not precede the flesh. Anybody knows that both the bones and the flesh They grow together simultaneously. One does not precede the other. So that is well known that Galen got it wrong. Unfortunately, whoever wrote the Quran did not tell themselves, and so far, Dr. Badawi is not aware of that as well. Now, let's go on to the last one, and this will be our last one for today because we are running out of time, and we'll end with it.
That in recent decades, and especially in last few years, with the constant attempt to destroy Islam and Muslims, we find various means of destruction. There is first the destruction of Muslims physically through genocide, as we have seen in occupied Palestine and in Bosnia, in India, in Kashmir, other places in Cambodia, in Burma, former Burma. We see one attempt to destroy Muslims or liquidate them physically. But what is even more dangerous and serious and very relevant to Muslims living in the West here, that I can see because I'm interested in that area. I see in literature, in the kind of speakers that are going around the country giving lectures to churches and other places, in talk shows, so books, talks, videos, that there is an attempt also to destroy Islam by attacking the credibility of its Prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They realize that Muslims are awfully lucky by having a book which is both authoritative and authentic, that there was no tampering, which is unparalleled in human history or any religious faith. So they want to attack both the authority and authenticity of the Quran. And if I had time, I could have given you more examples of the so-called errors of science in the Quran, errors of grammar in the Quran. There are lots of all kind of unjustified and erroneous critiques, unobjective. It appears objective, but it's really unscientific and unobjective attacks on the authority and authenticity of the Quran, and through attacking its own teaching, that it's old-fashioned or cruel or whatever.
Well, that's a good one to end off with. Now, who is whining here? Are these the only examples Badawi can find, those few that he had a hard time even remembering? He did not remember about the Rohingya there in Burma. He could not even recall that. But take a look at what he was bringing up. Fascinating when there are hundreds of much greater genocides in the world perpetrated by Muslims themselves against Christians. To say that this genocide is only going one way, that it's only coming, the victims are all Muslims, I think is not only heinous, but absolutely ahistorical. Now, what I found really fascinating, lectures against Muhammad and the Quran by Christian polemicists are even more dangerous than physical genocides? Did you all pick that up? That this is more dangerous than physical genocides? Is he serious? Unless, of course, maybe he realizes how dangerous this really is. It is more dangerous. For him, it is absolutely dangerous what we're coming up with. The fact that he considers that these polemicists, and he's talking about David and me, he's talking about us, because we are the ones that have been confronting him. He's referring to us. We are more dangerous than any genocide against Islam anywhere else in the world. Can you then understand what the dilemma they're up against? Folks, we are that dangerous, and I think we should take this pat on our back. We have material now that is going to destroy Islam. We have material now that is going to destroy it in my lifetime. We now have the material of ready to go public. So I am excited. Listen, I want to see Islam destroyed in my lifetime. I said this many places, and many people have attacked me for saying that. I don't want to see Muslims destroyed. I want to see Islam destroyed. Do you see the distinction? It's very clear that we have to love the Muslims. I don't know how you can help but love Muslims. I would not dedicate 37 years of my life to a people that I hated. Absolutely, I love them. It's what this book does to them. It's what the man does to them. And that's why we have to attack it at its foundation. No wonder we're so dangerous. We're more dangerous than any genocide. Because if we destroy the Quran and we destroy Muhammad, the book and the man, then we have destroyed Islam. And he will have no platform to speak on. Yes, I can understand then why he considers this more dangerous. But that should give us all the more motivation to get out there and make sure people hear this. Because more so than anybody else, we're the only ones that can take it to the world. We're the only ones that understand it better than any other. And we're the only ones that have the antidote to bring them home. God bless you.